Good morning to all those of you joining us from here on the East Coast of the United States. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to all those of you joining us from other parts of the world. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution. On behalf of Brookings Foreign Policy and our Center for Middle East Policy, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event as we launch a new book by our Distinguished Fellow, Itamar Rabinovich, Middle Eastern Maze, Israel, the Arabs, and the Region, 1948 to 2022. We are so pleased to gather virtually today to discuss the sweeping account of Israeli-Arab conflict and diplomacy, written by an author with singular authority and familiarity regarding so much of the story that he tells, having previously served as Yitzhak Rabin's ambassador to Washington and chief negotiator with Syria. Itamar is also a distinguished fellow here at Brookings, a member of our International Advisory Council, and serves as professor and president emeritus at Tel Aviv University, as well as chair of its Institute for National Security Studies. Itamar's important insider account adds the Abraham Accords, the policies of the Trump and Biden administrations, the Syrian civil war, the Islamic State, the political crisis in Israel, and much more to his 2012 book, The Lingering Conflict. Joining him on screen for this discussion of Arab-Israeli relations in the context of wider Middle Eastern geopolitics is Ksenia Svetlova, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Senior Research Fellow with Reichman University. Ksenia has been having some technical issues, but we do hope she'll be able to join us over the course of our conversation today. Finally, moderating today's conversation is Shibli Telhami, a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy and Foreign Policy program here at Brookings. Shibli also serves as the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. Before we begin, I would like to note that we're streaming live and we'll be taking questions from viewers, which can be submitted via email to events@brookings.edu or via Twitter with the hashtag MEMaze. With that, I will now hand the mic over to Shibli Telhami.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. It's really a pleasure to join my colleague Itamar Rabinovich, and Ksenia hopefully will join us shortly. This book is really an important revision of what Itamar has written in the past, and it's not just a revision. Honestly, it has a lot of updates, obviously for content from the past, but also it brings it up to date. Especially with a section on the Abraham Accords and the Biden administration. But I was even impressed that he managed to squeeze a short commentary on the current Israeli government. Obviously, I know how book productions go. They take forever, and it's hard to bring them up to date. So it's kind of interesting to see that he managed to do that, and the press worked with him to get that done. So what I would like to do is first call on Itamar to give us a little bit of a view of the book. And then if Ksenia joins us, then call on her to offer some remarks. And I'd like to engage Itamar with some aspects of the book, as well as take it beyond to the moment that he didn't have a chance to explore fully, given the timing of the book and the incredible events that we're all witnessing in Israel, Palestine, but also in the region broadly. Itamar, it's a true pleasure to see you. It's been a while since I've seen you in person, and I do know that you come at this from not just from the point of view of a diplomat who served during a really critical period where in fact there was true hope for Israeli-Palestinian peace, actually even Syrian-Israeli peace, as you know better than anyone on that particular issue. But you come at it also from the point of view, first and foremost, being a scholar of this issue, someone who was highly respected in Israel as a scholar of the region, but especially Israel's top specialist on Syria, and that shows in the way your style of writing and trying to combine your expertise with your experience as a diplomat. So I very much appreciated going through the book. Inevitably, it is a sweeping book, and so therefore you can't give justice, particularly to the background stories. That's a history that is rich and highly debated, and it's very hard to tackle it in depth, but you wanted to provide the readers with this background, and inevitably it doesn't get as much detail of all the different possibilities related to those. But the obviously the focus is really more on the Oslo till now. Those are the areas where a lot is brought into play from that combines both your own experience and your own scholarship. So I'd like, first of all, to call on you to give us a little bit of an overview, and then I want to welcome Ksenia. She has just joined us, and I'm glad that you managed to get over your technical difficulties and join the conversation. After Itamar gives his overview, I'm going to call on you, Ksenia, to offer your reflections on the book and commentary, and then I want to come back and engage both of you in a conversation about the book. Itamar, please.
Yeah, thank you, Shibli. Let me begin by showing the book itself. There's a full view of the book, but I will now start responding to your questions. So the book came about, it's actually a third incarnation of a book I first wrote when I ended my diplomatic mission in Washington. I decided then to write two books. One was the account of my negotiations with Syria, and the other was an overview of Arab-Israeli relations, peace, the conflict, and the peace process. That was published in 1998. In 2012, so much has happened that I thought I should write a second version of the book, and lo and behold, 10 years later, so much else has happened that I thought it was time to do a third version, and the Brookings Press was very happy to publish it, and the center was very happy to endorse it. So we have arrived together to this moment. So what is new about the book? First, the word, the region in the title, Israel, the Arabs, and the region. I think the region has become much more important in the scheme of things. To put it bluntly, the Iranian-Israeli conflict now often overshadows the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The very fact that Iran and Turkey have joined fully the Middle Eastern political arena has transformed that arena. These are two, in regional terms, mega powers, countries of more than 90 million with strong economies, militaries. Both actually do not necessarily see themselves just as regional actors, but as actors on the international scene, very much manifested more recently by the fact that, or by the collaboration between Iran and Russia in Ukraine, and Turkey itself has been active not just in the core of the Middle East, but in the Gulf, in the Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict, in Libya. Both are major players, and of course, both have difficult relationship with Israel. Iran is a conflict, Turkey is an on and off relationship. Right now, there is a certain rapprochement, but there were worse periods covered in the book. So that is one point. The other point, the changes in U.S. administrations and policies. We have the second Obama administration, they're very ambitious by John Kerry to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then, of course, certainly in terms of foreign policy, but not just, the unusual administration of Donald Trump, with his unique contribution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, first by having his team put on the table a very ambitious but not very realistic plan to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then, I would say almost inadvertently, his initiative contributed to the Abraham Accords, which were what I call in the book the unintended consequence of the Trump initiative and of the particular plan that his three aides put on the table. Third, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While some aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict seem to have been moderated, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is ever more intense. I call this a telescopization of the conflict. What used to be in earlier decades the full-fledged Arab-Israeli conflict is now to a large extent the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which makes it more focused but much more difficult. If there were those in Israel who wanted to see the Abraham Accord as the end of territories for peace and something that signals the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that obviously was erroneous. Actually, the Palestinian conflict, first of all, the Palestinians are there, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is there. And of course, more recently, less covered in the book, or only alluded to, is the fact that we now have an extreme right-wing nationalistic government in Israel that openly wants to annex the West Bank. I know that you are one of the authors of the book on one-state reality. From my point of view and the point of view of many Israelis, such Israeli policies just push forward towards one statehood rather than resolve the issue. Now we also had the Syrian civil war, a very important event in the history of the region. In a way, the last and saddest chapter of the Arab Spring, and with of course massive repercussions for the region from the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to the transformation of the Syrian state. I mean, Syria is now one of 6 failed states that we have in the Arab world. The regime is there, but only in 60% of Syria. Bashar al-Assad doesn't so much seem to mind it, and he and his people invented a term called essential Syria. They're in control of essential Syria, and the rest, I think, is of less interest to them. And of course, it also had repercussions for the Syrian-Israeli relationship. The prospects of a Syrian-Israeli peace deal now seem very dim, not very likely. And Syria itself is the arena of the Iranian-Israeli conflict. Iran is trying to build a massive infrastructure of missiles and other weapon systems in Syria directly under its control, and Israel, of course, is determined to prevent Iran from doing that. And now more recently, not so much covered in the book, but I think needs to be mentioned in the context of this event, as I mentioned, the establishment of a radical right-wing government in Israel. That government began its term by trying to transform Israel itself, change the legal judicial system and other aspects of public and political life in the country. So the country is now totally preoccupied with these issues. But of course, Israel cannot afford to forget that it lives in a quote-unquote dangerous place. And its relationship with the Palestinians, with other neighbors, will come to the fore at some point. How this particular government will deal with these issues is a different matter. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for this overview. Ksenia, I want to call on you to offer some reflections.
Well, first of all, it's good to be here. It's a privilege for me to speak about Professor Rabinovich book. And although I did not have a privilege to be his student because I studied in Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, but I can certainly tell you that back then in the 90s, when I was a freshman, I studied from his books on Syria and other issues. And also 30 years later, I continue being his student and just reading the words of wisdom and analysis, deep analysis about things that still matter today, because history matters. And today in Israel, given the situation that was so well described right now by Professor Rabinovich, you feel very much more than ever before why history matters, why the unfinished business, the unresolved conflict with the Palestinian, why it matters also when we are talking about such issues such as judicial reform and the changes perhaps in the very base of Israeli democracy, because those who support the coup against democracy, I don't have another word to describe it, they go back to the disengagement with Gaza, and they go back to the Oslo Accords, while many facts are being falsified, many, I would say, chains of facts are being completely rewritten, and while this is all modern history that we were witnesses of. Therefore, the importance of this book that basically sues together the most important developments in the sphere of Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the last at least 3 decades, but also gives a regional context. Because unfortunately, I'm saying it with a great sorrow, there are many also scholars, not only politicians, that tend to do this dichotomy between the regional and the Israeli-Palestinian. Let us deal with the regional, they say. Let us focus on Abraham Accords. It is splendid, finally somebody wants us in the region. But when you detach the core, and this is exactly the core, this is how it's also described in the book, the Israeli-Palestinian complexity, the conflict that still is very much today active, and perhaps might also go to the even more active phase this Ramadan. We can only say that, there is no regional without the, I don't know how even to regard it, the domestic. And in order to understand what is the importance and what is the influence, what is the ramifications of not solving, not tending to this conflict, you get it through going, through the pages of this wonderful book when you basically try to analyze what had happened in our region in the last 30 years. Of course, I agree with Professor Rabinovich about the telescopization, yes, that's how you put it, of the conflict being less Israeli-Arab and becoming essentially more Israeli-Palestinian. But again, this is today. This is today, and while many other things happen, and unfinished Syrian war that is being going into this lethargy stage, but still, the reasons for the uprisals are still there. Lebanon that is crumbling, other states that became failed states as well. At the same time, if somebody in Israel wanted to, nurture hopes that the world will just forget about what is happening on the this sphere of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, well, this is clearly a mistake. Everybody can see, and even if this conflict is not being followed so meticulously today as it used to be by Arab countries, certainly some 40 years ago and 50 years ago, and we are not in active stage of conflict with these countries. We are going to some kind of pacification and normalization, but at the same time, not tending to what was unfinished again during the fatal Oslo years, brings us again today on the verge of maybe cooling down the relations with some Arab countries in the Gulf. And if things will become more, things will escalate, then, everything is possible. And again, this acceptance of Israel into the family of the Middle Eastern countries, which seemed very much as a reality some 2 years ago, even 1 year ago. Today, still, I believe, that there is a question mark. The book of Professor Rabinovich exactly, catches, this framework of the region and the global changes that it lived during these decades. But we don't forget that the region keeps changing, basically every single day. While it's important to look at the past in order to understand the today, we also have to understand that the future might be also very, very different. I'm, of course, alluding to the future of Abraham Accords, some normalization that we experienced lately with Turkey. Again, things change here in an unbelievable pace, and everything is connected, domestic to regional to international. It was a pleasure going through the various chapters of this book, looking at how they are glued together. And indeed, looking into this picture of how did our home, the Middle East, change during these 3 decades.
Well, thanks so much, Ksenia. So what I'd like to do is engage the two of you, and while I'm going to ask some of the questions directly to Itamar, so feel free, Ksenia, to also weigh in, because this is a conversation, and it should be that way. And I'd like to, as I noted earlier, the book covers a lot of ground, but by default, because it wants to present a background, even as it focuses more on more recent history. So I'm not going to engage the historical part. That's just not, because it's not addressed in depth. It's intended more as a background. So I'd like to really address 2 issues that have been central, in beginning with the treatment of the failure at Camp David in 2000. And I say that particular issue specifically because, honestly, in historical perspective, we all look back at this, we know that's the most optimistic period was the 1990s. And it looked like there was a path toward achieving Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I think in historical perspective, the failure and collapse of the American mediation efforts at Camp David in 2000, which were followed by the Second Intifada, those events are the ones that have probably ended the prospect of 2 states in any foreseeable future. And so they are important. It's important to understand them. It's important to grapple with the history. It's important to grapple with whether it really was an opportunity, or whether we're just all kind of, not coming to grips with the reality that is structural, that wasn't going to make it happen. Now, in the book, which you treat this, in depth, this is obviously an area that you know about for a lot and you've been involved in. But you treat it in a way by providing different narratives about it. So there is the orthodoxy, that says, Arafat was just to blame and he's the reason why it failed. And then what you call the revisionist school, which includes, Rob Malley and Ara, particularly in the book that the article they wrote that became influential about, no, it's not quite like that. It's more complicated, and Israel is also to blame. But what you don't do essentially is something about the American role. And obviously, this was a mediated effort. Both sides were relying on the United States. In fact, as you know, Arafat and Barak hardly talked to each other at Camp David. This was all direct. Even the conversation was mediated by President Clinton. And so the question of the kind of as you know, we covered this ground in a book called The Peace Puzzle that I did with William Quant, Dan Kurtzer, Steve Spiegel, and Scott Lisinski. And we also went into interviews with a lot of the key participants to kind of try to figure out why it failed, taking these same accounts that you've stated and summarized very well in the book. And our conclusion was a little bit different. Our conclusion was there were really a couple of, obviously, yes, the Palestinians didn't behave in a way that they could have optimally. Barak himself, didn't behave like he should have in order to get an agreement. But there is a primary responsibility or a large responsibility that on the shoulder of the U.S. role, particularly Clinton, And it had to do more with the nature of the Israeli-American relationship, which is obviously it's central to everything that happens between Israel and the Arab states throughout the history. And you can't decouple the assessment of bilateral negotiations between Israel and Arabs, Israel and the Palestinians, without this American role and the relationship with Israel. So what we found, for example, is that Clinton never really considered this issue a strategic priority. He was doing it mostly, for maybe legacy, political support. But ultimately, while he came to empathize with the Palestinian aspirations, no question, over time, he was first and foremost looking at it through the prism of support for Israel. And that when he came in, basically, Rabin brought Arafat to the White House. And then Israel took Arafat out of the White House. Essentially, American foreign policy was responsive to Israel in terms of what Israel wanted. And when ultimately the Camp David failed, and it was no longer in Israel's interest, the whole issue basically, Clinton embraced the Israeli positions. The most graphic part of the story that you know well is that Arafat did not want to go to Camp David because he didn't think they were ready, that hadn't talked about all the critical issues of the day, all the critical issues that need to be resolved had not even been discussed in detail between Israel and the Palestinians and the Americans. There was no even preparation by the American team of final status issues, not sufficient, that is, in our opinion, in that book. But Arafat was worried that Barack and Clinton would gang up on him, and then they would blame him for the failure, and that this is a setup. And as you know, the Clinton administration promised him that they wouldn't blame him no matter what. In the end, as you know, Clinton made a decision, and the decision was very much at the urging of Barack, to blame him because it was politically convenient, he thought, for him. And ultimately, that really closed, in a way, the chapter in terms of the options available to Arafat after that. We also noted in that book something related to the relationship between Clinton and Barack, that almost all officials in the U.S. government, including the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, all thought were unhealthy because Barack was too responsive individually in unprecedented ways. I haven't seen that, where the prime minister of another country would call the president any time of the day and bypasses the National Security Advisor, bypasses the Secretary of State, developed a personal relationship where Clinton was highly responsive and sensitive to his political needs in Israel. So that actually, to me, that really frames the picture in some ways, because America has as American-Israeli relationship, and the solidity of that relationship over the years has been a major factor. And I would say that at Camp David, that was a huge factor in the failure at Camp David. And since then, obviously, the absence of accountability over time has added to much more failures. But I want to draw you on that one, because that's not exactly the way you frame this issue, as you basically tell the story of what the different views are on the failure at Camp David in 2000.
Okay, very good question, very important point. Let me broaden the picture a bit and put in the Syria negotiations, because I think a major opportunity that was missed just before Oslo was to make an Israeli-Syrian peace. That when Rabin gave the deposit to Secretary Christopher and surprisingly expressed willingness to withdraw fully from the Golan in return for a package of peace and security, this was mishandled by the secretary, and the secretary and his team also, in a couple of days later, flew back to America, because it was August and vacation time. I thought that was a huge opportunity missed. Could have put the peace process on a different footing, but it was missed. Now, as to Camp David, I think the point I would stress is not so much the one you presented, the closeness between Clinton and Barak and the Israeli prism through which Clinton and the administration saw the issue, but the absence of a more assertive, more manipulative approach. I'm using the word manipulative going back to Camp David I, to President Carter and the Egyptian-Israeli peace. It would not have been achieved but for the peculiar style of Jimmy Carter, who could be persistent, sometimes nasty, sometimes manipulative, but he made it happen. He didn't want it. If you remember, the initial response to the Sadat visit to Jerusalem from Carter was not positive, but once it happened, he took charge and saw it through. And Clinton was too nice and mild a person in a way to be a second Carter. So that's an interesting speculation to make, that a Carter at Camp David II might have made the difference. But to your specific point, I think Arafat, well, as you know, Arafat did not want to come to Camp David. He was not ready. He thought it may have been a setup, as you say. Barak very much wanted to go to, because he saw that what eventually happened in the Second Intifada was about to take place. He used to speak about the Titanic in cabinet meetings in Israel. He very much wanted it, and obviously it failed to happen. So I chose, as you mentioned, to bring the four categories into which the Camp David literature is divided. Not everybody liked the place I gave him or her in that literature, but anyway, that's the way it is in the book. And maybe another point, you correctly said that the earlier part is a sort of a brief account of the early conflict. I simply decided I didn't want to write an 800-page book. No one reads 800-page books nowadays. So I chose to give a relatively short survey as a background and focus on events from basically the 1990s and on. There's plenty there.
No, that's clear, and that's obvious, and we all do that. I mean, to give a background, you cannot get into too much detail, but you still have to present the background. So that's clear. I want to move to the Abraham Accords because that's a new chunk in the book, and obviously very important one. We're still dealing with the consequences. But I want to ask Ksenia if she wants to add anything to what Itamar said related to Camp David first.
Well, actually, I was about to ask a question about the missed opportunity, the Syrian opportunity. And in this regard, I think that it's important perhaps to clarify another point. While progress might or might not be made, the Iranians were increasing at the same very time their involvement in the Arab Middle East, and their original aspirations were pretty much known already by then. Do you believe that progress that could be made with Syria, Israel with Syria, would prevent an expansion of Iranian entrenchment in Syrian soil, Lebanese perhaps as well, and other Middle Eastern countries?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the point, Ksenia, because and also to some extent in response to Shibli's earlier comment. The U.S. peace team, the group of experts that worked first with President Bush and then with President Clinton on the Arab-Israeli peace process, was divided into two: the quote-unquote pro-Palestinian group and the pro-Syrian group, namely the one who wanted more Palestinian-Israeli settlement and the one that preferred the Syrian-Israeli settlement. The one that preferred the Syrian-Israeli settlement thought that if Syria were taken out of the conflict with Israel and from the Russian sphere of influence, it could transform the geopolitics of the region. And consistently, they preferred the Syrian deal to a Palestinian deal. They were disappointed by Rabin's decision to go to Oslo and not to continue with the deposit. They were then unhappy again with the decision to make the second deal with Jordan and not with Syria. And they had their final chance in 2000. In late 1999, Assad, for a brief moment, did want to make a deal because I think he wanted to leave his son Bashar a clean desk. But at that point, he was too weak physically and politically. He was dying. And when President Clinton met Assad for the last meeting in 2000 in Geneva, a very unsuccessful meeting, he met a dying man, and that was a brief and a very unproductive meeting. So,
may I interrupt you, Itamar, on that meeting? One thing you didn't mention about it is that Clinton felt betrayed by Barack because what Barack had told him before he went to meet with Assad in Geneva turned out not to be accurate, and he was angry. So the failure is not just in the failure in the communication. The messaging that came from Barack to Clinton was not correct.
Yeah, that I agree. There was some tension and criticism there. Yes.
So let me switch to the Abraham Accords, because that obviously is really an important part of the book, and you discuss that in a very revealing way and helpful. There's a lot of detail, particularly on the annexation. So the first thing I want to ask you is I want to ask you really two questions on it. One question is about how it came about. I mean, we all know that the Trump administration had basically failed in its effort, with the deal of the century, and without the Abraham Accords, they would have had nothing to show for it. And so anyway, the United Arab Emirates saved them. And for that matter, I would argue even saved Netanyahu, not just saved the Trump administration. And I want to just to elaborate on that, because you deal with the annexation as a proposal that came, from the Trump administration to Israel when it looked like the deal of century wasn't going to come about. We are in the process of finishing up a sequel to the peace puzzle, where we also have a huge chunk on the Trump administration. Did a lot of interviews of people who were involved, top people who were involved in the Trump administration, the UAE, and elsewhere. So we have, sort of formulated some ideas on it that are not very far from yours. But I just want to bring up a question related to the annexation part. And part of it is that there's this idea that the deal stopped Israel from annexing parts of the West Bank. But what you say in there very clearly is that was not necessarily on the horizon, even if David Friedman, the ambassador, the US ambassador in Israel, wanted that. Netanyahu may have wanted that, but members of a coalition like Gantz and others opposed that. And obviously there was also political consequences for him, relations with what was likely to become by that time an American democratic administration with a pushback. So was that even possible that Netanyahu would have done that? Or was that just like a fig leaf? It provided a fig leaf for him politically at home to be able to say, well, I got something much bigger than implementing annexation. So how do you see that annexation piece fitting into this deal?
I think in order to understand that episode, as well as in order to understand what goes on in Israel now, we have to mention the fact that Netanyahu is in the middle of a criminal trial, a serious one, that he reached a conclusion that he must remain prime minister almost at any cost in order not to go to jail or to survive the trial. He looks at what happened to Olmert, who left the prime ministership and ended up in jail. And that makes him very weak and vulnerable in his negotiations with coalition partners. Now he knows that his natural support base is on the right. Settlers, the Settlers Party, ultra-Orthodox, Shas, and so forth. And these are the people he caters to. And when the annexation element was introduced into the deal of the century, the Trump plan, or his team's plan, the settlers demanded that he implement it. And he was under pressure to do that. But as you indicated correctly, at that point, he had a coalition government. He had Gantz and Ashkenazi in the government, and they would not let him do that. And the Trump administration came to the conclusion that this was not viable. They were willing to look at an alternative to that policy, and then came the very assertive policy of the Emiratis, who wanted this. I think this was the Emiratis were latecomers to the under-the-table relationship with Israel that so many other, or several other Arab countries in the Gulf had before. But once they joined it, they wanted to take a precedence in view of their desire to be depicted and to be a leading and important actor. And their role in this is indeed very important. Now, the annexation element is still with us. I mean, when Netanyahu made his coalition agreement with the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the two radical right-wingers, they put into the coalition agreement the notion of settlement. Yes, Netanyahu kept some maneuverability with language, but the element is there. This is a government that wants to annex the West Bank, be what may. So there is a certain similarity to what existed before the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords themselves, I think, have been slowed down a bit by the formation of this government. It's difficult for the Emiratis and others to proceed with Israel as if things were normal when things are not normal.
Okay, so I want to take that a little further. Okay, on the Abraham Accords with regard to all the peace efforts between Israel and the Arab states that have kind of bypassed the Palestinian issue, and whether or not the net outcome has been essentially to embolden the far right in Israel, and in the sense that they can do what they want on the West Bank. They don't have to compromise with the Palestinians. The U.S. will continue to back them to make peace with the Arab states. The Arab states themselves are doing it. And not only did Trump obviously conclude the Abraham Accords, but it's also the Biden administration adopted them and is pushing with the same theory, the theory being that let's do that independently from the Palestinian track rather than condition relations with the Palestinian track. And I say that because now in historical perspective, when we look at the issue of accountability, incentives, and to make peace on the central issue of Israel-Palestine, one can argue that almost all of the peace agreements, certainly including the Camp David Accords in 1979, have in essence come at the expense of a just Israeli-Palestinian agreement. One can argue that the Carter administration that you mentioned, obviously, Carter is on our minds these days. I hope he lives longer every day that he lives. I think he's a bright light onto the world personally. But at Camp David, while the Camp David in historical perspective looks like it came at the expense of the Palestinian issue, it came at the expense of the Palestinian issue because obviously it took out the biggest leverage that the Arabs had on behalf of the Palestinians in this equation. When Carter went into it, Carter thought at the time that this would actually make it more likely to reach an agreement on the Palestinian issue. And as you know, there was an agreement, an autonomy agreement on the Palestinians that was not directly tied to the treaty with Egypt. Sadat himself thought it was going to help resolve the Palestinian issue. Sadat, was assassinated very shortly after, and Carter was defeated. I had multiple conversations with President Carter on this, in which he felt, that he would have used the Camp David Accords to move forward on Palestine had he been reelected. Obviously, that didn't happen. So what I would say here is that, people were saying about the Abraham Accords, yes, let's make it, it'll make it easier because Arabs now will weigh in and they'll have a voice in Israel and they can impact the Palestinian issue. Instead, what we saw is obviously it emboldened the right and the argument inside. We don't have to make peace with the Palestinians. The Arabs will come to see it our way. So I want to reflect on this. I mean, is this not a failed strategy when it comes to advancing the most critical issue now? We've got, we're talking about an Israeli military rule over the Palestinians for most of a century with no end in sight. I mean, it is not just a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue, it is a rights issue, it is something that needs to be addressed today, not in 10 years. And have these accords really made that less likely or maybe even impossible?
So I'll come to that point, but let me make two introductory comments. One is there has been a certain fatigue in the Arab world with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was reflected in the Abraham Accords, but also surprisingly among the Arabs in Israel. The fact is that an Arab party, affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, headed by Mansour Abbas, joined an Israeli coalition for the first time when the Bennett-Lapid government was formed. And it reflected a view that said, okay, there is the Palestinian question, we are ourselves Palestinians, but it's time we looked after ourselves, after our interests as citizens of the state of Israel. These two developments, I think, are two manifestations of the same mood, which is not the exclusive mood in the environment, but is there. Second, I don't think that the radical Israeli right wing, the messianic right wing, represented by people like Smotrich, were emboldened by necessarily just by the Abraham Accords. I would like to draw your attention and those who listen to us to an article published or to an essay published by Smotrich in 2017, in which is called Time for Decision, in which he presented his view in a way of one statehood. Say we should annex the West Bank and we'll deal with the Arabs in three different ways. It's a terrible piece, very irritating, very frightening, but he published it in 2017. And what happened was in the elections of November 2022 is that by happenstance, he rode on the shoulders of Ben-Gvir. From a small party of 4, they became a party of 15, and they could dictate terms to Netanyahu. So it's not a byproduct of the Abraham Accords. It's something that has been growing on, the rise of a messianic streak among the settlers and among the Israeli radical right wing. And finally, the Palestinians reacted, of course, very negatively. The Palestinian Authority and other Palestinian spokesmen to the Abraham Accords. They have discovered now that they can actually work with the Emiratis. The Emiratis have become much more involved. And I was hoping that the opening of the Emirates and other countries, Morocco, Bahrain, and so forth, to Israelis would, in the long range, help to moderate the Arab-Israeli relationship, because Israelis meet Arabs of different persuasions, are very much affected by this. This is not something immediate, but something that could help Israelis and Palestinians to come to terms, because they have to. Now, finally, to the point you mentioned, I'm a scholar. The book, I think, is scholarly, but I'm also call it an active member of Israeli civil society. And as such, I belong to different groups and organizations that are trying to keep the idea of two states alive, and try, if not to make it happen now, at least to keep it alive.
Thanks so much. I know Ksenia wants to say something on this, but I just one comment on the far right. I didn't mean the far right's position has hardened. That's been their position. It's just that argument, which says we don't have to make peace with the Palestinians because the Arabs are going to normalize anyway, resonates more with the Israeli public. It's more persuasive, and therefore, that neutralizes an argument. It used to be an incentive, or put as an incentive, if you just like along the Arab peace plan, if you end the occupation, then you get full peace with the Arabs. And obviously that's been bypassed, and that argument is no longer an incentive for the Israeli public in the political discourse. So that takes away from those who want to see change take place in the Israeli policy. Ksenia.
Well, first of all, I would like to reflect on what both of you just said, and just to mention that just 2.5 years ago, prior to the launch of the Abraham Accords, the polls that were conducted in Israel showed very strong support of the whole of the Israeli society. Amazing 85% supported the peace with UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, and so on, over annexation. So if some members of the political sphere in Israel were perhaps emboldened by this naive belief, that the Palestinian issue is abandoned forever and nobody will tend to it anymore, then the general public seems to be moving in the opposite direction from that. But of course, this is something that polls change, public opinions change, and it also depends how you pop the question. The second remark is about the Saudi Arabia. I think that precisely in these days, and again, the pace of events is so fast and everything is so fluid that sometimes you say, well, I don't have enough privilege and time to reflect on what just happened. And now you understand, and I think Netanyahu understands it very well, that while, he was building on the Middle Eastern NATO and joining Saudi Arabia to the Abraham Accords, suddenly Saudi Arabia is actually makes peace again with Iran. And the broker is China, not United States. And the Saudis are saying every single day that there is no peace, there will be no peace without the tending to the Palestinian issue. So that's what I meant, when in the introduction remarks, I said that, well, that we are living the history. These very days, history is here. It is happening. Historical events, are happening almost every single day. In the end of it lies the reality, which is, it's a bitter reality for many Israelis who would love to think that we are past Palestinian conflict already, but we are not. And of course, the inevitable question is whether the current coalition or any other right-wing coalition that might come here in Israel would choose Saudi Arabia and the Arab world over annexation, and whether it's crippling annexation without the formal announcement or the official annexation of, let's say, Jordan Valley or some other parts, whether it will be choosing the relations with the Arab world, just like the Israeli people apparently want.
Yeah, so whether there's formal annexation or not, that's a side story. It's the situation on the ground with de facto annexation that matters. The formality of annexing in some ways would take away the kind of illusion that there isn't Israeli control right now, and there is. So I don't think that in a way, even if the technicality of withholding annexation without changing the reality on the ground has no practical meanings for the Palestinians, in all honesty. But I want to, since you mentioned the renewal of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a very important event. I know we'll run out of time, but I want to take a few extra minutes to address that and give Itamar an opportunity to address that, because this is an issue he's thought about and written about elsewhere. So I want to just briefly, Itamar, if you could give us sort of your assessment or read of that relationship, that agreement, that is.
I'm looking at it in primarily in two contexts. One is Yemen. I think it's very important for the Saudis to end the civil war in Yemen, to stabilize it in some way. The effort to obtain a military decision have failed, and they see Iran as a key to that. And secondly, it needs to be put in the context of their relationship with the United States. There is anger in Saudi Arabia, among the royal family, at the United States, particularly at Obama and his administration. Let me mention the piece written by Prince Turki Ben Faisal, "We Are Not Free Riders," was a direct response to Obama. Biden and his team are seen by them very much as a continuation of Obama. And, they treated Biden very poorly on the question dealing with the price and flow of oil. They are not with the United States on Ukraine. And now to mend fences with Iran and do it through China, of all partners, was a direct challenge to the United States. So these are the two contexts in which I see it, Dr. Wheaton.
I think that those are really interesting comments, particularly about the Yemen piece, driving a lot of what the Saudis are doing. Just quickly, from my point of view, put aside the China piece, that's another big story. But I think if, in fact, this is an agreement that will create a little more Saudi-Iranian cooperation in the region, a little more, we don't expect, remember, they have strategically opposing interests in the region. But if a little bit more cooperation emerges, this is good for the region. And why I say that is that I think that we're just on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the most devastating war in the region, the Iraq War, that has been destructive across the board. But one of the destructive aspects of it was the intensification of the proxy wars between Iran and Saudi Arabia that have been devastating, including in Syria, including in Lebanon, including in Iraq, including in Yemen. And if there is a chance that this cooperative relationship will reduce those conflicts, that's a good thing for the Middle East. I'm really grateful for you for joining us, for writing this book. And Ksenia, I really appreciate your comments, your insights coming on it. Good luck with the book. It's an important one, and I think it will be read. And thank you for Brookings, for holding this event. We'll see you all later on. I believe that I don't know if anyone is coming on to end this conversation, but I am looking forward to the next Brookings event. Thank you all.
Thank you
very
all.
much. The privilege.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.